Hello and welcome everyone to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. Thank you guys for tuning in. We've got a great show ahead today where we'll be covering everything from the IDP rankings. We're going to continue with those, going into the fantasy college football rankings, and for the first time ever in the history of this show, I'm going to be talking about fantasy baseball. We're going to do a little mid-season roundup. But as always, before we begin, I do ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show. We also do receive a lot of comments, so if you are willing, do please leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. It is a huge support to both me, the network, and my fellow podcasters, so it is greatly appreciated as always. So, without further ado, let's get on into the show. We begin today's show with a segment about a very important Game 5 in the NHL between the Panthers and the Rangers. A huge conference game after my guy Sam Reinhart, who I told you guys about last time we talked about this series, scoring an overtime winner to even the series at 2 games apiece. He's such a great asset, and just before we begin, I just think that being able to talk hockey as a constant is such a special thing, because once we get into football season, hockey will fall by the wayside. So it's just been so fun talking hockey while we still have it around. But going into tonight's game between these two teams that are so well evenly balanced, we've talked about a lot of big stars for both teams. They have this players, but for tonight's game I want to highlight some players who can play up to their potential but just haven't, either in this series or for the postseason as a whole. Starting off on the Panthers side of things, in such a well-rounded team where you can get production from any level of this team, there aren't that really many holes that I can find, but there are some players who I definitely think have that untapped potential and can swing the series in the Panthers' favor. Let's start off with a player who is very hit or miss in my opinion, but when he's on in spades, and that is Carter Verhaeghe, their first line player, a player who they entrust a lot of their offense with. But he still is a very hit or miss player throughout his career. He has had some very huge moments, but he hasn't really pieced it all together, and I'm looking for him to be a big player in tonight's game to help the Florida Panthers take an advantage in this series. Tonight, in DraftKings, he is valued at 8.6K, only 4.8 fantasy points projection, but like I said, he still has that potential to have a huge game. We saw in Game 3, even though it was an overtime loss, that he had a huge game for them, one of their best players in that game. 2 goals, 2 assists. So you can see that Carter Verhaeghe is one of those players for the Florida Panthers that when he can produce, the Florida Panthers are a better team for it. And because he's in that first line, obviously a lot of it will have to go through him eventually. But still, in my opinion, he's had a really disappointing postseason and series overall. Only 6 points this postseason. So I really am looking for him to step up for the Florida Panthers in order for them to take control of the series. Another player who's a little bit more low-key but is also one of those well-rounded guys who can get hot at any moment. I'm looking at a player in Sam Bennett who, if you are looking for someone in fantasy who defines the term well-rounded, it is Sam Bennett, playing on their third line. Obviously not a huge headline player in terms of the Florida Panthers, but he is still a huge asset, whether it be in terms of power play, in terms of penalty kill, in terms of hits, if you're in one of those kind of leagues. So ultimately, I think that Sam Bennett will play a huge role in both ends of the ice in tonight's game. He is valued at 6.8K and 8.3 fantasy points, a little higher than a guy in Verhaeghe who you would expect more out of, but still, Sam Bennett is a solid piece to the Florida Panthers that you cannot forget about if you're looking to fill out your fantasy hockey team. On the Rangers side of things, they also have a lot of different players who really need to step up in order for them to take control of this series. Honestly, the New York Rangers as a team are right there in my minds as one of the Stanley Cup contenders. They just need everyone in this team to contribute, and these two guys speak to that notion. I'm going to start off with a guy who, ever since he came in a couple years back, has been a very solid player for the New York Rangers. And in this postseason, he has played well, but in this particular series, I'm looking him to score more goals, and that is Artemi Panarin in their second line. Tonight, he is valued at 9.6K, a little bit pricey for him. 12 fantasy points, though, so a little bit higher than the Panthers players who I talked about. He does have 14 points this postseason for the New York Rangers and 5 assists in the series, but those are the only points he has in this series, and he needs to score goals. He was brought into this team, yes, to produce, but also to be a goal-scoring threat in their second line to add more balance and depth to this team. Obviously, when you look at the New York Rangers, it's him, Kreider, and Trocheck as your big three. And of those big three, Artemi Panarin, at least in this series, in my mind, is kind of falling by the wayside a little bit. Yes, he can provide assists. Yes, distribution of the puck is important for the Rangers as a whole. They want to be aggressive. They want to work on their passing and move the puck up the ice in a timely manner. But overall, Artemi Panarin needs to also add more goals because this series has been very tight. We've seen both teams kind of struggle to score goals. We've seen some goal-scoring explosions from both teams as well, highlighted by Game 3. But more often than not, these are two teams who are trying to tactically figure each other out, and that is why this series is even. So look for a player tonight in Artemi Panarin to be the heartbeat of the New York Rangers' offensive attack and output. On the defensive side of things for the New York Rangers, I'm looking at a guy who is probably one of the best, most well-rounded defensemen in the league, who simply has not produced up to his stature, and that is Adam Fox in that first line pairing with Ryan Lindgren. Obviously, the Rangers pride themselves on having a defensive mind like Fox, a huge part of who they are in terms of a defensive unit. He is one of the many leaders in this New York Rangers team that kind of marries both their offensive mindset with their defensive mindset. Tonight, in terms of DraftKings, he is valued at 7.6, kind of a steal for a player of his caliber, but only 5.3 fantasy points, and I think that's reflective of his stats as well. Only 3 points in the series, and while yes, he's not necessarily a guy who you expect points out of as a defenseman, but as someone who has been in the Selke Trophy conversation for the best offensive defenseman over the past couple of years, you do kind of expect Adam Fox to add that kind of point value as well. However, he is very solid overall as a utility option for a fantasy hockey team tonight. I think he still needs to step up for the New York Rangers to have a chance. Obviously, this series has proven to be a very defensive-minded series, even though we have seen some goal-scoring spurts, like I said. But Adam Fox is one of those players on the Rangers who needs to show that aggression, because the New York Rangers are a team that really isn't overwhelmingly good in any particular statistic, and that kind of speaks to how their team is built, They have the weapons offensively, right? They have their big trio in Trocheck, Kreider, Panarin, some younger guys as well like Lafreniere and Kakko wanting to contribute, but they really don't necessarily stand out in one particular area. They just perform to the best of their abilities on any given night, and that is why they are here. And they're going against a Florida Panthers team that just has a depth and structure to them unlike any other team in the NHL outside of the two Western Conference finalists, in my opinion. So you are looking at a series that needs second kind of level players to step up and produce on both ends of the ice, whether it be a third liner on the Florida Panthers in Sam Bennett, who I expect a lot out of as someone who can be like that important depth piece both in real life and in fantasy, or whether it be a guy on the back end of the ice in terms of Adam Fox for the Rangers, who I expect a lot out of, both offensively and defensively, marrying what Peter Laviolette wants to see on the ice in both ends of the ice. So ultimately, I think that this particular game tonight will come down to the hard tacks. I think that goals will be very hard to come by tonight. That has been seen in terms of the over-under, in terms of points, sitting kind of like where the Western Conference Finals are kind of sat at as well, in my opinion, where it's at 5.5 and it hasn't really moved up or down. The money lines have been very reflective. The betting trends have been very kind of static. They stayed in the stasis where they haven't really gone up or down for any team. But that goes to show how good of a Final Four we have in the NHL right now, where we have very well-balanced, well-built teams that can produce exciting hockey series, and allows me to talk to you guys about who I think will be the best fantasy hockey players on any given night. We have such fantastic input to give you guys because of the fact that these players, we have seen so many different players on both conferences stepping up in spectacular ways, and ultimately I think that tonight in this Panthers-Rangers series we will see another unsung hero, whether it be Verhaeghe or Panarin, whether it be on the defensive end of things. I think that this series just has so many great players, and you just don't want it to end just because of the volatility that these teams present. But that should just about do it for this segment of today's show. Coming up next, we will be continuing to our final rankings for this IDP system. We will start with the D-backs. We will end with the D-backs coming up next on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Network. We will be right back.